Welcome back to the Gentleman's Gazette in our series on bespoke shoes, where we show you how shoemaker Amara Hark-Weber is making a pair of shoes from start to finish by hand. Today's episode 6 is all about sewing together the uppers, and you can see how the upper pieces are cut and all the other parts of the series in our playlist. My shoes are finally starting to take shape. Actually, we can't quite sew the pieces together yet, because before, the leather has to be skived. Now what is that? Basically, it's thinning out the edges so there will be no bulging later on and everything looks smooth and neat. As you can imagine, this process of thinning out the leather is especially important where the leather is folded or where it's layered. Why? Well, otherwise it would be super obvious. For example, in our video on best dress shoes under $300, you can definitely see shoes where the leather wasn't skived as neatly and it looks much more bulky. Now, the basic skiving work can be done on a machine if the shoemaker has one. Now, some may argue that it's not true handwork if a machine is used, but in fact, you can have different settings on the machine, but it needs to be finely calibrated, and it's very important to understand what you're doing by hand, otherwise you'll screw up the pieces. Every step, how you hold the leather, how you position it, the speed at which you pull it through has an impact on the final output. So in my mind, there's a lot of handwork involved here. It's like keeping a straight stitch in a machine. The operator has to be very skilled and attentive in order not to screw it up. Skiving can also be done by hand, and it's typically done with a blade at a very flat angle, so you get very thin edges. Amara Hark-Weber does both for her bespoke shoes. First, she uses the machine, and then there's certain areas where she wants to use hand only or finishing things by hand. Amara prefers handwork to refine the edges, but some areas also skived completely by hand. Of course, she can do it all by hand, but the machine is very consistent and gives her the same or better results as doing it by hand, so why not use a machine? Any excess leather that may remain is actually burned off for a very smooth result. So now the finished pieces of the uppers can be sewn together to prep for the next step, broguing. Every time I mention the word brogue, I feel there's a joke I need to make.
Oxford's not brogues.
Words to live by, Eggsy. Words to live by. Try a pair.
Now, unlike in a factory, Amara will be doing all the broguing by hand, which allows her to be more detailed, consistent, and with a diamond brogue, it requires individual special attention anyways. If I had chose round brogue holes, it would have been easier and quicker. I know I'm a tough customer. Or very attentive to detail, as Amara might have phrased it. So for my broguing holes, Amara used the diamond punch as well as a small 2-hole punch. Together, they create a visually pleasing pattern that doesn't look cluttered. Boy, do I feel special. To ensure an even spacing of the broguing, everything is marked first before it's punched. Because remember, once it's punched incorrectly, you have to start the entire process of creating the uppers all over. You also never want to punch holes in an area that will later be folded or stitched together. So before you use that hammer, pay attention. It's the last chance to hammer any details before the leather is permanently marked. As Amara and I finalize the decision for the brogue orientation, she starts with the ones that are most prominent in the center. For example, in the cap dough, she started with the one that was aligned on the center line, not at the edges. With the first hole perfectly positioned, it will look very pleasing, and the ones at the edges don't matter as much anymore. Of course, you want them all to look neat, but frankly, that's not what people notice. It's the middle one.
I think that if you have a tendency toward geometry and dimensional thinking, then making patterns isn't too hard.
I don't know about that. I think it's pretty skilled what she does. Sometimes when you do this, you see exposed leather edges, and Amara uses a rechargeable dye pen that is similar to the color of the uppers to make it all look smooth. Typically, it's better for the pen to be darker than lighter to avoid any unwanted blend. Yes, edge coloring takes time, but it's a small detail that has a big impact on the overall look. Now, not all raw edges are necessarily dyed. Amara finds that the inside of punch holes or the broguing is typically not dyed because sometimes it bleeds and looks worse than without it. Also, the little contrast can be quite pleasing to the eye, especially in areas where the leather is stretched, like on the outer heel cap, for example. I particularly like the look of the contrast edging there. I think if it would be all the same color, it would lose visual interest. Amara also takes time to remove any debris by burning off little bits, which were there maybe from cutting or skiving. Now, Amara tells me that broguing varies greatly from shoemaker to shoemaker, so she's always really excited to see how other shoemakers are doing it. So once the broguing is done, it's time to assemble the uppers so everything is ready to be sewn together. First, she puts the heel counter and the quarters together, then the quarters, and then the vamps. Then she joins them around the facings. Essentially, it's like creating a back of the uppers and then a front, and then you combine them at last. Because of the unique design of my shoes, we just have a back and then a long front. If I had a cap toe, that would have to come together at this point. But it was just a faux one.
I'm just trying to think of what's going to be the most advantageous so I can get the most precise stitching.
Right on, Amara. When it comes to stitching, the experience and skill of your shoemaker is really important. Your shoemaker is trained to make your shoe dreams a reality. Often it requires a creative thinking process because every shoe is somewhat different. Now, typically when you do broguing, you also have some kind of backing that will show underneath those holes that you just punched out. Sometimes it can be leather, other times it can be fabric. Some people like to play with a contrasting fabric to be really loud. Now, while I may have thought about it for a second, I realized it's not good for a classic menswear shoe to have such a bold element, like a flashy turquoise backing underneath your brogue holes. So I decided to just go with the leather. Sometimes you can also have piping, which can be contrasting or the same, the upper edges that will look nice afterwards. Now, the backing doesn't just beautify the brogue holes, it also adds a structural reinforcement. Oh yes, fill in the brogue holes. After all, these are not supposed to be perforated shoes. Although, for summer, maybe that's what you want. Of course, the backing is also skived down to ensure an elegant look. Amara uses her fingers so she can feel that there are no bumps and everything is skived in the right way. Throughout the process of attaching the leather pieces, you will see Amara use glue. Now that's not because it just wants to glue it together, but it keeps everything in place and neat so it's ready for stitching. Also, it helps to give it a tight seal. In much cheaper shoes, glue is used instead of stitching, but that's not the case here. So if you see your shoemakers using glue, don't worry, they're not cutting corners, they're just ensuring an ideal outcome. Now Amara uses spacers to fully understand where she has to sew things in the right distances so everything looks aligned and not out of whack. Then she stitches the strip in place. For some reason I really like the sewing machine, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it.
It's this German machine, you know, straight lines.
So you know it's quality, not that I'm biased or anything. Now it's time to handle the facings. These are the portion of the uppers where you find the lace holes in. The facings are particularly under a lot of stress because that's where you have your thin shoelaces and some people may really pull hard on their laces. So you want to make sure that the leather doesn't age prematurely here or that the holes rip in. Therefore, the facings are particularly reinforced. The reinforcement helps to create the rigidity, stability, and durability that you want in that area. Typically, it can be made from leather. Others use fabric or a certain kind of fiber tape. Apparently, some even use duct tape. I would not have guessed that one. Ultimately, you need something that is stable, thin, and doesn't stretch. In this case, Amara decided to use specific fiber tape she's used many times before, knowing that it will do the job for this shoe. She embrusses again, she cuts to the desired shape, adds glue, and then rolls it down for a tight, refined seal. Next, Amara glues together the main pieces of the uppers. She revs up the edges where the glue will be applied, so everything will adhere better. So first everything is glued together, and then it is stitched. The stitching follows the top and bottom of the brogue lines. Reinforcing the back of stitches is really helpful to ensure you have a quality product that will last many years to come. You can use leather, tapes, or linen, but Amara likes to have something really stiff that makes sure it will stay in place. Even though it's a sewing machine, Amara uses the hand crank a lot to just make sure the stitches are exactly where she wants them to be. After making the initial stitch lengths on the vamp, she gets out her spacer again to ensure everything will be just right. Amara says that the second or even the third line of stitching is harder to do than the first line. Frankly, I think even the first line is already incredibly difficult, and my uppers would look terrible. At the end of the day, how the overall design and stitching will come together really depends on your shoemaker or their upper maker and what they do in what order. If you have the chance to see it, I found it was extremely interesting, yet time-consuming. When Amara made this shoe, she used a mallet to ensure everything was tight and proper. I don't know how she does it today. Maybe I'll see with the next pair of shoes. When attaching the facings to the uppers, she uses glue, but she has to be careful that there's no excess glue that would leak through the broke holes. Once again, there are multiple rows of stitching, which is more difficult. And at this stage, it seems like the facings are overlapping, but it's pretty flat, and later in the shoe, everything will be fine. So don't be nervous. It's just another example of how a shoemaker has to think three-dimensionally with two-dimensional items. At this stage, Amara uses the backing fiber to reinforce the facings. Then she stitches them into place very carefully and gently. Because the shoes have a rather high stitch density, she doesn't want to weaken anything and avoid any extra stitches. Now, on leather, having a too high of a stitch density is actually disadvantageous because it makes the leather less strong. So talk to your shoemaker what they recommend and don't go overboard and ask for more stitches. In fabric it might be better, but in leather it's worse. Your shoemaker will typically suggest a certain type of thread and a stitch density they know will work. So I definitely went with her recommendations, because obviously I have no specific clue about it. In order to properly realize the design we discussed, she has to account for those dimensional differences. For example, the curved point on this Adelaide shape looks very exaggerated when looked at the flat. But later on the final shoe, where it's round, it will look different. In fact, it's actually perfect. But you can tell this wasn't the first time she was doing this. Honestly, overall, I was really impressed by the entire sewing process, because unlike with fabric, if you make one mistake, even at the very end, you have to start all over again. Now for the lining, I didn't just want an interesting color, I also wanted some fun customization, and Amara offered to add text into it. So I had to come up with something, could have been my initials, but I opted for the words best foot in one shoe and then forward in the other. Amara obliged, and it was a small little detail that no one really ever gets to see. Before inserting the lining into the uppers, Amara made it all wet. Why? Well, that helps the lining adhere to the uppers to make sewing it together easier. Now, wetting the leather alone isn't enough, so she actually uses some clips to hold it in place. Now my shoe looks almost like an office supply store.
You can shop our store.
Once everything is wet and clipped though, it can be sewn. Any inconsistencies here can be marked with a Sharpie pen. Frankly, that's not what I expected, but apparently that's a little trade secret. You didn't hear that from me. As you can see, the lining is sewn with X's on it that can then be trimmed once it's all sewn. Frankly, I didn't realize it was done that way. Of course, you have to be very careful in cutting the lining without accidentally cutting any of the stitches she just made. Otherwise, she'll have to do it all over again. Apparently, some makers even skive the top part of the lining, but Amara doesn't like that because she feels like it will make it break prematurely. Of course, there are always different schools of thought, so if you're interested, talk to your shoemaker about it. Once the linings are cut, Amara once again uses her pen to color the edges. It's a little detailed, but if you compare the before and after, it's quite obvious which one looks better. Makes a noticeable difference, doesn't it? Now it's time to prepare the tongue and the throat. Frankly, the tongue will be prepared in a very similar way as the facings. Distances are checked with a spacer, letter is punched, pads are cut out, and then skived. Amara then prepares the uppers. She draws a fold line at the throat. Why? Well, it ensures proper width and comfort. She also applies reinforcing tape to keep the throat structurally sound and reinforced for many years to come. She also cuts back the edges to ensure that everything lies flat in its final shape. Now Amara folds the edge of the throat down for an improved hold. That means there is no exposed cut edge. And if you know a thing or two about higher-end leather goods, folded edges are more difficult to make than edge painting. Interestingly, punching the eyelets are one of the most nerve-wracking parts of the whole thing. Why? Well, again, once it's punched, it's set. If it doesn't align, go back to square one. To reinforce the eyelets, you will sometimes see metal grommets. Sometimes they're just visible from the lining side. Sometimes they're also visible from the outside. But that's typically something you only find in more rugged, casual boots, not in a fine Oxford dress shoe. In this case, my upper leather was very thick, so Amara thought it wasn't necessary to add them in the back, and so we skipped them. In line with the Adelaide, we made the bottom holes wider than the top, trying to maintain that same line. So Amara carefully lined up her pattern as discussed, and then punches the holes. Now, before we can see if the eyelets were punched correctly, we have to finish the lacing system. That means the tongue has to be attached because it's underneath. Now Amara prepares the tongue lining. Sometimes you can also add a little bit of foam in between the lining and the tongue upper to provide an extra level of cushioning and comfort. Then she glues the lining and sews it, and then she trims off excess pieces after it's sewn. At this stage, Amara confirmed the final position of the tongue with me, just to make sure we're all on the same page. Typically, your shoemaker can advise you on how the tongue should be best for this shoe or your particular foot. Here, I suggested that the line of the tongue should follow something that was already in the vamp for consistency. I think it looks great and it also functions well too. Again, I wanted that consistency in the overall shoe. Then we take one last trip to the sewing machine. Next up are stay stitches. They're little stitches that are meant to hold movable parts of the shoe in place over time. Amara uses 3, one in the middle and one on each side. Again, every shoemaker may be a little different here. You can see her using an awl to poke the central hole. For the thread, linen and hemp are traditional. Amara prefers Texan on the other hand, which is a synthetic fiber that is much stronger and more durable because it doesn't decompose over time. Again, there's no right or wrong. Some shoemakers just preferred the traditional stuff. And frankly, when it comes to clothes, for example, we do too. Now, finally, we can add a shoelace and see if the eyelets were punched properly in the right place. Because if they don't align and the lines are not parallel or off, you are not going to want to wear the shoe. As Amara laced the shoes was just something that she had laying around, I had to bite my tongue to not talk about the Fort Belvedere shoelaces and all the varieties and colors we have. I'm happy though to report that the eyelets were punched correctly and everything looked the same. Of course, it will look even better with Fort Belvedere laces. Now, as all the pieces are assembled together on the uppers, that more or less two-dimensional thing can now become a three-dimensional shoe, but in the next step, we have to work on the insole. It has to be applied to the last, and a channel has to be worked out. So you can see that in our next episode.